Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off all mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. I have apologies from Jim Hume today, and the agenda item 1 is subordinate legislation. It's items for the committee to consider a negative instrument as listed on the agenda. Members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to this instrument. I refer members to the paper and ask the committee if it's agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument on Bathing Water Scotland Amendment Regulations 2012. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. So we can move on to agenda item 2 on the Land Reform Review Group. First agenda item this morning is for the committee to hear the Land Reform Review Group's initial ideas. When the committee agreed its work programme for the coming term, we agreed to look into the work and progress of the Land Reform Review Group, along with its finalised remit as agreed by ministers. And I have great pleasure in welcoming today Dr. Alison Elliott, the Chair. Good morning, and Professor James Hunter, Vice Chair of the Land Reform Review Group. And I would invite Alison, James, if you wish to make an initial set of remarks that might help us focus.
It comes
that
on
works
anyway.
Automatically.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to meet everybody around the table. I'm particularly hopeful that we'll keep contact and channels open with yourselves and with other MSPs. I mean, it seems to me that as MSPs, I imagine that you're one of the first ports of call for people who have concerns about the land system, and I think that you may well have a particular view on land reform and land-related issues, which isn't necessarily just a repetition of the standard party lines of the various lobby groups which are around in this area, as well as, of course, having a policy interest in the subject. Jim and I are both very committed to the whole area, and we welcome this opportunity to get a group of it again. Where do we start, Jim?
Well, I guess... I guess at this stage, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'd echo Alison's comments about keeping in touch with you and other MSPs over the next few months. At this stage, we've been obviously engaged in working out how we are going to do this job. We've obviously initially had some discussion with the ministers and others about the nature of the remit. The remit has now been finalised, and you've no doubt had a chance to have a look at it, and we're looking to finalise imminently our work plan for the year and a bit ahead of us in respect of getting to our final report. So up to now, I think it would be fair to say that we've been focused on the way we do the job rather than on, though obviously we've thought about that as well, but we've been more focused on the process than on the content, as it were, of what we're about.
One of the things in terms of process is that we have identified the 4th of October as being a key date, by which time we hope we will be able to issue a call for evidence, publish the list of advisors, which we have signed up already, and also publish a work plan for the rest of the year. We're also hoping on we've planned that for the 4th of October we'll have the first meeting with our advisors. So that's the putting a sort of limit on it in that sort of a way. As far as the topic is concerned, I think our approach is to cast the net as wide as possible to begin with, and then narrow down to what is manageable later on in the process.
Very good. When we first discussed some of this subject last year, we referred back to some of the words of Donald Dewar in the 1998 McEwan Lecture on Land Tenure, and the summary at the end says that he considered that we should be aiming at the future and not the past, that we should be trying to remove barriers to opportunity, that we need to increase diversity and that the increase in local involvement and decision-making was essential. So I presume these would be very much in line with the kinds of things you're thinking about just now.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I'm looking forward to this discussion and debate being very different, in a sense, from the one that happened in the 1990s, because I think at that point, well, we were focused on getting rid of feudal tenure. There were a few well-known case studies around which dominated the way in which the debate happened. I think various things have happened since then which lead to a different kind of debate. First of all, the whole question of community empowerment is a key issue for the wider public debate, and therefore it makes it easier to do what people have always wanted to do, which is to include the urban question in issues of land reform, because we've got a common language there to speak across the different communities. We are in a recession, which means that we also have a that means that maybe there is questions you can ask more readily about things like tax relief or subsidies and things like that, which you would ask in a different way at times of plenty. And of course, we've got 10 to 15 years now worth of experience of what happens when communities do own their own land. And so you're starting from a very different base. So I hope it'll be a different kind of discussion.
Indeed.
I think it's particularly welcome in that context that the remit that we've been given and that's now been agreed is extremely wide-ranging, and indeed more wide-ranging than many, perhaps including me, who would have anticipated some months ago. So I think that's very much to be welcomed, and clearly the remit touches on some of the points that Donald Dewar made, better part of 15 years ago, I guess. And in particular, I think while it will clearly be one of our key concerns to look at the operation of the 2003 Land Reform Act, we will obviously be expected to cast our net beyond that into a range of other issues. And as our remit says, to have regard to urban as well as rural Scotland. And I guess also, even in the rural context, to not focus, as the whole movement towards community ownership has tended to focus so far, on the northwestern corner of Scotland, as it were.
Indeed. Well, I think we'll just...
should add that the northwestern corner of Scotland is, of course, extremely important. So let me not disparage it in any way.
As a representative from that area, I could agree. First question from Dick Lyle.
Yes, good morning. Actually, Professor Hunter, you touched on near enough the question I was going to ask you. In July 2012, the Scottish Government did announce that it was setting up your review group. And it said, and I quote, "will oversee a wide-ranging review of land reform in Scotland." How wide-ranging are you going to be? Are you going to be radical, or are you going to be just touching the edges?
Well, it would certainly be a bit premature to outline the precise content of what we eventually say, because obviously at this stage we don't know. But certainly our aim is to be wide-ranging, and when we issue the call for evidence that Alison mentioned, and that'll be fairly shortly now, we would anticipate hearing from groups and individuals across Scotland and people involved in a whole range of issues relating to land that certainly, as I said earlier, will not confine our attention to issues of community ownership and the like, but will range way beyond that. And the expectation clearly on the part of government, the Scottish Government, is, as our remit states, and as the First Minister has said himself, that government is looking for innovative and radical proposals across a wide swathe of this territory. I'm well aware, and we are well aware, that there's a lot of complexity in there, and it's, I think, unlikely that we would, as it were, provide draft legislative proposals on every single aspect of what might be covered by our remit, but we certainly intend to look widely across the subject areas, as it were, that fall within land reform in a general sense, and also to look widely territorially across Scotland.
Can I, through you, Convener, can I tease out, and I know you're making up your work programme, and I know you're going to be calling for evidence, can I tease out what initial reforms you think are required?
Well, the convener before the meeting was pointing out that this has been going on for 1,000 years, and so it's not exactly that we are at the start of the whole process. I think that we wait and see where the concerns are. I mean, I'm afraid I do start. I think I don't want to close down the debate at the very beginning by saying this is what we're going to do. In fact, one of the things which our remit tried to do was to unpack what land reform means, because listening to a lot of the debate, it sounds as if people have in their mind that land reform is about community ownership in the Northwest, as we said. I mean, it tends to be a package, which I think is diminishes what the potential of the subject is. And so I think if you look closely at our remit, the first 3 bullet points really are identifying the different areas where that land reform touch on. They touch on very fundamentally the relationship between land and people. And that is if you're going to be radical, then examining that and going back to the roots of what in the past we have thought that should be and what in the present and the future we think it should be, that's one of the ways of being radical. It touches on how land is owned, and it also touches on how land is used. And so we've been trying to unpack these rather than talk about land reform as a package, as if we knew exactly where the pinch points were going to be, although we recognise that the old agenda, or the agenda of community ownership, is not finished, and there's, we do have to keep that to the fore. But I hope that we'll extend it into the urban situation. I hope I'm fascinated by what's going on in the borders, because, there's all this stuff about land reform up in the north, but what is happening in agricultural areas and rural areas in the south of Scotland, and also having a view to the international comparisons, I think, is going to be important.
I think in that context, it's fairly clear from our remit, and it's a self-evident fact that Scotland has one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership in the world, and certainly in Europe, and that it would be rather odd, given the call for innovative and radical proposals, and given the fact that our remit says that one of our aims is to identify how land reform will enable more people in rural and urban Scotland to have a stake in ownership, governance, etc. I think clearly one of the key areas, I suppose, that we would want to explore is how that pattern can be changed in the way indicated in our remit. In other words, in what ways can the land ownership pattern become less concentrated and perhaps more equitable?
Can I thank you for, you basically did answer my question. Thank you.
Alec Ferguson, please.
Well, thank you very much, Convener. And can I start off by agreeing entirely with yourself and with Jim Hunter that the northwest of Scotland is indeed extremely important. Almost as important, I would suggest, as the southwest of Scotland, which is where a part of which I represent. And I was very pleased to hear you say that the current land reform, particularly in the use of community ownership, has tended to concentrate in the northeast, because I think there has been a very sort of patchy response to it in the south of Scotland, and almost a feeling that, oh, this isn't for us. And this probably isn't so much a question, but if you'd like to comment on it, I'd be grateful. Do you see part of your remit as to positively and proactively trying to find ways of encouraging greater community ownership throughout parts other than the northwest, if I can put it like that? And you've already answered the urban one, but is that very much part of your remit to see how that can be expanded?
I think that one of the things for me is when you do now hear the stories about the impact that community ownership has had on communities, particularly in the Western Isles. And you see communities being released from attitudes and a feeling of being held back, then I think if it's possible to allow communities to flourish in that kind of way, then it's something that we need to develop. Whether you do it by ownership of the land or whether you do it by other ways of engaging and empowering the communities, I think is something that is for the future and for a much more interesting and a much more detailed kind of debate. I don't think we want to go down the line of saying that there is only one answer to this question, because the question itself is many questions. But I think the idea of, again, thinking of a time when financial resources are limited, what we have to do is to look at all the resources we have. Partly that is the resources that are tied up in the land, but it's also the resources that are tied up in people. And if these haven't been able to be released and used to the best ability up till now, then that's bad stewardship. It's bad stewardship of people's assets as well as of the land.
Thank you. Can I just continue that very briefly? I mean, I absolutely hear what you say, and I understand entirely what you say, and I've got a great deal of sympathy with most of it. But I take it that you will be going into this whole exercise with a view that there are ways to make changes, and you're going to look at all sorts of different models, hopefully, and not just say this is not just about land ownership. This is about lots of other ways of empowering people. To release the potential of the community, etc. So could you just confirm that you're going to this with an attitude that not everything that exists is necessarily bad, that there are perfectly good examples around the country, and you would hope to build on them rather than just change things per se?
Absolutely, we're looking for positive ways forward, and if there are already positive ways out there, then sure, let's build on them. I mean, I come into this having been on the Christie Commission, and the way in which we were able to do that in 6 months was only because there were good examples out there. And I imagine the same kind of thing is going to happen here, that we will be seeing examples as we go around of ways in which this can be satisfied, and trying to build on them. Yeah.
Well, again, I would just finally I would commend exploration in the south of Scotland, because I think
I very much look forward to that.
Hopefully, show you some of that.
Good.
James.
Well, I simply want to confirm that we would definitely want to look at how some of the very beneficial consequences that have resulted from community ownership in the Highlands and Islands and particularly in the Hebrides, can be extended into other parts of rural Scotland. And it's not the interesting thing about what has happened in these localities, whether it's Gia or Naidert or South Uist or wherever it may be, is that the issue is not simply about changing ownership from an individual or a consortium or some such to communities, but the fact that in every case, in some cases obviously more dramatically than others, but in every case this has served to unleash enterprise and initiative in some ways quite remarkable way. And we've seen a business flourish, population rise, and so on, houses provided in areas where previous owners would not have done that. And I think that there is scope for such initiative clearly in other parts of the country. And that's not to say, and I agree entirely with Alison on this point, that's not to say that there are only, as it were, two poles to this debate of outright private ownership at one end and community ownership at the other, but clearly there will be and there has to be some scope for variations, as it were, between these two poles, and that there's no reason, in principle anyway, why under a private ownership there can't be more community engagement and even blends of ownership of assets within a particular locality. So I think there's quite a lot to be explored there. But at this stage, as I say, early days, and certainly with regard to community ownership, I think it would be a great pity, and I know this committee has expressed this view when you looked at this area not that long ago. it would be a great pity if community ownership of land comes to be regarded as something a little bit like crofting, something fairly exotic and different that exists only in one corner of Scotland and has no relevance to other parts of Scotland. I think we have to move away from that and look at how we get community ownership up and running in an active sort of way in the south and southwest and indeed the northeast and other parts of the country.
If I
Yep.
very, very briefly, just to finish, Convener, thank you. Just to clarify that, am I right in saying that you are suggesting perhaps that this could be as much about empowerment as it is about ownership?
Yes, but having said that, I think there is an issue with regard to ownership also, that the ultimate form of empowerment is to have ownership of an asset. So I'm certainly not ruling that out, but I am agreeing with you that there can be advances without advancing all the way to outright ownership.
Thank you, Convener.
Very good. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Dr. Elliott and Professor Hunter. I would wish at the outset of my remarks to make a plea for awareness of a very successful community buyout in Comrie, the village I live in Perthshire, where we bought out the old, well, firstly prison of war camp and latterly army training camp at Cultybragan. And indeed, I would like to, since we seem to be doing this morning, extend also an invitation to you both to come to Comrie to discuss the outcome thus far of that buyout in 2007 with the people who were most involved, because they have, I think, a lot to say about the wider issues of empowerment, but also about the process issues, because, of course, the committee itself identified when we looked at this last year some very important process issues in terms of the community buyout procedure that require, I think, attention to make it, to facilitate better outcomes. And I was very struck when Professor Hunter mentioned a moment ago that that, in his view, the ultimate form of empowerment would likely involve ownership of an asset. And I was very struck by that remark, because when Comrie voted to buy out the land, many people in the village of a different generation were really quite thrilled, because they had never owned anything, any heritable property in their lives, and they were very thrilled and proud to have reached that point in their lives to see this huge societal change happen in their village. Looking again at the process of your work, which you have ahead of you, which I think is going to keep you all very busy, I just wondered how you intended to go about collecting evidence. Will you be targeting certain organisations or groups, or will you be just issuing a general call? Or how do you see that working? Because, of course, there'll be many people, I suspect, that would love to have the opportunity to have discussions with your group, but may not, for whatever reason, make a direct submission further to your call for evidence.
Well, that's something which we're very conscious of, and we're very conscious that, you know, you go and visit one part of the country and people 50 miles along the road say, why didn't you come to see us? And we can't go everywhere. We have, in terms of identifying and targeting people, we have actually spent the month of September meeting with 4 of what we reckon to be the key players in the areas, just to introduce ourselves and get a quick heads up on what they expect from the review. We met with Andy Whiteman, Scottish Land and Estates, Community Land Scotland, and we're meeting DTAS next week. And so they are people that we reckon that will be bumping into for various reasons throughout the year. The general call for evidence is general, because I think we want to, very often the interesting idea comes from someone who's not in the mainstream, and so we hope that we'll be able to identify the good things coming out from that. Our advisors, we hope, will be pointing us to specific areas, to good examples, to particular people we should be seeing. I've got a list of key people that I would like to have a conversation with. For example, I would like to have a conversation with people from the Scottish Law Commission, for instance, as people who not only know about what the law is, but know how it might be changed. And so that's kind of specialised areas. We are continually when I was appointed to this position, over the summer I kept telling people about it, and everybody had a story about land reform. I mean, it is a hugely pervasive issue. And so we are getting a lot of people requesting us to go and visit. How we do that, I don't know. We'll have to do that in conjunction with the advice of our advisors, and also with the advice from our secretariat and support team. But we certainly mean to be active, we mean to be visible, and we mean to cover the country as much as we can. It's a great opportunity, and we're looking forward to actually seeing what's going on the ground, because you can read reports till you're blue in the face, but actually seeing what it's like, seeing what Scotland's like from different perspectives is crucially important, as you all know.
Certainly help the tourist industry if you take all your advisors in the shoulder season to visit different parts of Scotland. Claudia Beamish.
Good morning to you both. And from my own perspective, it's very heartening to hear some of the points that you've made already in relation to the questions that have been asked by the committee previously. I had a particular concern about the focus, again, without criticising what's happened in the Northwest, having been to Gir and been completely inspired as one of the members that went there as part of the Rural Affairs Committee on a visit, but having a real concern representing the whole of South Scotland about perhaps even the lack of understanding about the possibilities. And I'm wondering how you might be able to engage with communities who don't necessarily know what those possibilities are in the borders or in Clydesdale or the Southwest. Because we were given the example when we went to Gir about how people from Gir, until they'd visited, I think it was Egg, but I might be wrong on that, hadn't really understood what the chances were and how they would be able to take the land into their own hands and what the structures were. So I'm just really wondering about that, about how you might do that, and also how, if it's appropriate to ask, and I don't know if it is, but whether how the advisors have been or will be appointed in relation to how widely that would be advertised, or in terms of also geography and equity, and which I'm very aware that is the sort of remit of the group, but really if you're able to shed any light on how that process has happened as well. Thank you.
I'll deal with the advisors. We're conscious that people want to give us advice from all kinds of places, so we're not going to be short of advice. So we had to think a bit about what the role of the advisors would be relative to the other sources of information. And we certainly took the line that that if we wanted the party line from a particular lobby group, then we would go to them. We don't need to have an advisor with a particular hat on. And so we have explicitly said to our advisors that they are there as individuals with a particular experience and particular background. Because we also want advisors who can move the subject on and can help us to move on, so they have to be free to change their own minds as the process goes on. And so I think we've identified a large group. We didn't advertise in that sort of way. It was a case of building on a set of names which had been provided for us, in a sense, by the department, the Rural Affairs Department. And we have identified a dozen people, and I've got a list of the kinds of areas they cover, because most of them have got more than one hat as well. And they cover, as I can see it, land research, agriculture, Highlands and Islands, economics, crofting, planning, access, urban studies, legal questions, rural development, forestry and community woodlands, estate management, land ownership, urban community development, and we've got a chartered surveyor. So, you know, it's spreading it as widely as we can amongst the advisors. And their job is to be at the end of the phone when we need them, we hope. It is to possibly come with us occasionally, I mean, not all of them at once, despite the convener's suggestion, when we make a visit, if we think that we need the support of one of our advisors at that, to to point us in the direction, as I say, of other people. And also we were hoping they might set up expert seminars for us or things like that, where they would identify people who could come together and give us a briefing on a particular area. So we're very excited about the list of advisors that we've got, and I wish we could tell you who they are. Gia.
Yeah, simply to very much agree with you that it's hugely helpful to people on the ground to actually see it firsthand what similar groups of people have actually done. And in fact, I don't think there's anything better than that in terms of fostering a sense of what the possibilities are around this whole area. And you're quite right to say that the people in Gia, who incidentally began by being somewhat sceptical and indeed in some cases hostile to the notion of community ownership, were convinced that it might be something for them to go for when they saw what was already happening at that time on Egg, which was one of the first instances of community ownership going back to 97. And Gia was 2002. And so yes, that's the case. And clearly, if there were mechanisms that enabled people in other parts of Scotland to have a look at some of these instances, I think that would be helpful. I think also what has been hugely helpful in this context in the Highlands and Islands is that all of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, an organisation about which I'm not totally unbiased since I was its chair for some years, but I think that the role of what was called its community land unit, it has another name now, but the role of people within Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the role of the agency itself in fostering that sort of contact and in providing information and backup, and of course financial assistance, that was and remains important. And there hasn't been, and this is not a criticism of Scottish Enterprise or other agencies, but it is simply a fact that the rest of Scotland, and particularly perhaps the southern half of Scotland, in the borders and the southwest, which shares many of the difficulties, and in some cases in the southwest actually exhibits rural deprivation in a much more extreme form than most of the Highlands. These areas have lacked an organisation like HIE, and I think that has been disadvantageous in this context, and that's something that could be looked at. If I could say also, incidentally, and this is really just further reflecting on a point that Alex Ferguson made, that this looking to get communities engaged with land is not simply about transferring land in private ownership to communities. It also has been and must be in future about transferring land in public ownership to communities. And that is extremely important. And if the Scottish Government wishes to foster this development, then it has got to be made easier, and no doubt that's something we'll be examining. It has got to be made easier for communities to take ownership of the rather vast tracts of Scotland that are in the ownership not of private landlords but of the Scottish Government itself or its agencies.
I'll come back briefly. It's a broader question in terms of the remit. I'm wondering whether there will be opportunity, although perhaps it's asking too much, but to be looking at models in other countries and whether that's something that you're considering.
Fact-finding missions to exotic countries.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially in December and January will be extremely welcome. Yeah.
Yes, certainly. I think certainly we have to, because so often, I mean, this is an area in which there are a whole lot of fault lines, and one of the ways you deal with a fault line is to, raise the game or look outside. We have to find out that when two areas are at loggerheads, it doesn't have to be like that. And very often the way you demonstrate that is by showing how it works in other countries.
I do think, to be more serious about the question, I do think that is important, that there are constant references, and I made one myself earlier by saying that we have a more concentrated pattern of ownership than other countries, etc. That there are constant references of that kind made to other countries, where usually it is alleged that these things are done better than here. And I think it would be important to try and understand a little bit more about that, and about how other countries have evolved, and indeed about how ownership patterns have changed within the British Isles themselves at the instigation of British governments, the most glaring example being, of course, Ireland, which does not have the sort of ownership pattern that we have, and it doesn't have that because of land reforms instigated not by Irish governments, but before Irish governments existed, by the then British governments in the early part of the 20th century and the very end of the 19th century. And so Ireland has a very, very different pattern of ownership to Scotland. And one might wonder whether that is better, whether it's worse, whether it helps with community development or not. And of course, there have been many, many changes in Scotland itself that are not all that well understood. If you go back 100 years, all of Scotland, almost all the agricultural land in Scotland was tenanted. And today, a considerable proportion of it is owner-occupied. And has that change, which happened usually without state intervention, has that change been for the better? Is Orkney a more prosperous place, as some would suggest, because it has an entirely owner-occupied farming structure? Is that one of the reasons why it is a relatively prosperous and successful rural community as compared with others where that doesn't prevail? These are questions that could be looked into and haven't perhaps been as fully explored as might be.
Just to clarify a point on that, clearly the government is looking at the industry bodies such as Tenant Farming Forum and the Rent Review Group are bodies which are meeting at this time. How do you articulate your work with theirs?
One of the things, and also the Community Empowerment Bill going through at the same time as we're doing our work. I mean, I would like to see this as being complementary and positive feedback from the one to the other. I think we have to take advice from our civil servants and other people who understand how you get that information and buy-in. Yeah.
Very good. Right, Graham Day, next.
Thank you, Convener. Just to clarify, the plan is to produce the final draft report and have it to ministers by December 2013, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, given the wide-ranging remit that you have, the importance of the subject, and the anticipated workload that it sounds as if you're going to be taking on, are you operating to an achievable timetable?
I think it's part of the task is to make it achievable, and we will have to whittle it down. I mean, we can't. And one of the dangers, of course, of opening it wide to begin with is that people will become disappointed if we don't pick up everything that comes along. But I hope that you know we're hoping that we will be able to have in a sense recast and focus it by Easter next year, that sort of time. And then go into a second phase, in a sense, of testing out the detail and the specific proposals within the areas which we will then be looking at, and hopefully picking up ones which look feasible and where there are some proposals out there for how it might be developed, or if we have our own proposals.
So you feel you can do justice to the subject in the 14 months that you have?
Not when it's something that's been around for 1,000 years. That would be. But I think yes, and I think that there's something to. I mean, we will just have to cut it to suit the cloth and so on, because and we're not pretending that it will be comprehensive. It can't possibly be comprehensive, but it will be, I hope, wide-ranging in the sense that it will not just be focused on closing down the conversation at the very beginning. It's all ahead, I'm afraid, in that sense.
We should perhaps clarify that what we've been asked to do is provide a draft report by the end of next calendar year and a final report by April 2014. So, so there's a little bit longer than you indicate, but yes, we're under no illusions that it's a very big task, and we're certainly not expecting, as Alison said, to produce something that is utterly definitive on all aspects of this issue. And what we would envisage is that we produce something that is fairly wide-ranging, or as wide-ranging and as comprehensive as we can make it. And it'll be up to government and yourselves, no doubt, to take the process on from there.
Yes, I think part of the report will be to say this is an area that also needs to be looked at, and this is how it should be taken forward.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Margaret McDougall.
And good morning. Much of the discussion we've had this morning has been around communities and empowerment and ownership. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about how you're going to look at the current legislation, and have you already perhaps looked at that? You did mention that you would, you know, the Law Society would be one of your contacts. And also, I would like to ask about new entrants into farming, and you know, you're going to be looking at that as well. If you could maybe just give me a bit more information about how you're going to look at that.
I think in terms of the present legislation, there has, of course, been a very helpful overview of the impact of the 2003 Act, which has been helpful for us as a starting point. And already in the conversations, the informal conversations or the preliminary conversations we've had, we're picking up a lot of issues from that, where there seems to be a wide consensus about there being difficulties, or where the pressure needs to be put for moving that one on. Part of that being the report which you yourselves produced earlier on, indicating the areas that need to be looked at. When it comes, I mean, if you're asking, do we draft what the legislation should be, I suspect not. But I'm conscious that we do need to have advice from people who understand how to do that. About what kinds of proposals we make, because part of our remit says that we have to come up with proposals that will be sustainable and that will be testable and so on. So we'll be putting it through that kind of a mill. You were asking about about
how we attract new entrants into the farming industry.
Right,
yeah.
right. Jim, do you have an idea on that one?
Well, just to revert to the current legislation, or at least particularly the 2003 Act. And both the review that the Scottish Government published at the same time as we were appointed, and your own investigations and other investigations have highlighted clearly some areas for concern with that Act. Not so much, I think, with the access provisions of Section 1, where no doubt there are improvements that can be made to anything, but in general terms, there seems to be a fair degree of satisfaction with the access provisions of the 2003 Act. There are particular issues with Section 3 of the Act, which gives crofting communities a right to purchase crofting land on a community basis. And there's no doubt that that Act created a climate of opinion which facilitated the transfer of some crofting, or essentially crofting estates like South Uist, Gulson and Lewis into community ownership. But ultimately that was through a process of negotiation and with ultimately a willing seller. Some of the sellers have been less willing than others initially. But there's absolutely no doubt, and experience has shown, particularly in the case of the Park Estate in Lewis, that Section 3 of the Act does not seem capable of delivering, and certainly not delivering in any reasonable timescale, what this Parliament intended when it passed that Act. The detailed provisions of the Act with regard to mapping and other requirements are such that, as some lawyers have said, they are arguably impossible to achieve. So there are areas there of concern. And clearly, we would be looking to make some comment about that as we go forward. And the issue of access to, getting new tenants into agriculture and new entrants into agriculture, whether tenants or owners, is clearly a very difficult issue, and it would be, I think, rather ludicrous to suggest that we are going to solve a problem that is not only a problem in Scotland, but across the UK and indeed across Europe and beyond, that we're confronting an ageing farming population, we're confronting a very high land prices, we're confronting a lack of and a reducing number of available tenancies and so on. And that is, as I've said, a very difficult and intractable issue. It is clearly a very important issue, and it's an issue that we need to give some thought to and hear what people have to say about. And so we will be looking at that and perhaps particularly trying to establish how land reform in the widest sense can contribute positively to making that a little bit easier than it currently is. But there are all sorts of difficulties there in terms of the nature of agricultural support from Europe, the capitalisation of that in land values, the high cost of getting access, of getting entry to agriculture. All of that makes this a very difficult issue. And it would be rash to say that between now and the end of next year we're going to solve it. So, but we will certainly give it consideration.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. The review group is clearly at an early stage, and we certainly look forward to having sight of the work plan and indeed the list of advisors as soon as you can release it. There are, of course, prime examples of good practice which have been mentioned already. Not least the North Harris estate, for example, where an agreement has resulted in the estate being community run, while Avonshire Castle continues as a standalone private enterprise in itself, which seems to be working in quite harmoniously together. And other examples such as GIA have already been mentioned. I'm curious, in my previous committee on the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, we recently oversaw the passage of the Land Registration Bill. And I was wondering if, as part of your remit in the group, whether you'd be looking at ways of encouraging increased land registration, which is clearly the purpose and the target of the bill that we've recently just put through. And also one other question with regard to the reporting back to the committee. I'm just curious as to how often you expect to update the committee and when we can expect further details.
The land registration one we haven't discussed, but I mean there are various. There have been other aspects of legislation which are either current just now or have happened since the 2003 Act as well that we really have to get our minds around, and I certainly haven't so far, but it's on the agenda for once we dig into this. In terms of updating the committee, we have been asked to, and we expect to be able to come up with an interim report around Easter, hopefully with some proposals which could be taken forward immediately rather than waiting to the end of the report. And so that's one kind of interim report. We expect to be doing, to be coming up with thought pieces and, writing at various points, and we could certainly share that with the committee. We are anxious, since it is an area where everyone is ready to, are anxious to hear what is going on, that we don't set hairs running suggesting that we're going to be solving one problem or addressing one problem, whereas in fact we want to allow our thinking to develop over the whole piece, with it being such a large area. So we're a bit cautious about saying this is the way our thinking is developing, but insofar as we feel we can say that, and we feel that it's a reasonably honest way of proceeding, we're happy to be open with the committee on that.
Can I ask you a question just more generally? First of all, it's a subject which I know James has been involved in for a very long while, and it refers to the Convention of Human Rights, but it's very pertinent today, given the article with regard to the enjoyment of private property, but also the view that the state can enforce laws that are deemed necessary to control the use of property in accordance with the general interest. It seems that in some cases at the moment, the question of the general interest is in the courts, as we know in the case of a tenancy issue. But I wonder if you've had thoughts with your legal advisors about how we might express that general interest in a more specific fashion in your overall workings.
Well, the short answer is we haven't investigated that at this stage, but we're well aware, obviously, that that is an area that we need to give consideration to. I suppose I tend to take the view that that the convention, the Human Rights Convention, is not as insuperable a barrier to change in this area as is sometimes suggested. And but I would hesitate at this point. In fact, I won't say anything categorical about it until we've thought about it further. But it is clearly the case that government in the public interest can limit the enjoyment of property, and does so all the time in all sorts of ways with regard to planning, constraint, environmental legislation, and much else. So that the days when the owner of a piece of land could do whatever he or she liked with that piece of land are, for better or worse, long gone. And there is, of course, lots of precedent in Scotland, some of it admittedly antedating the Convention of Human Rights, but not all of it, that facilitates and seeks to bring about changes of ownership and the rest in the public interest. So I don't think that should be regarded as an insuperable obstacle, but it's one that requires some detailed consideration, as you're well aware.
Yes. Thanks for that. I think it's important to put in the record that we're dealing with quite fundamental issues related to the legal status of ownership and tenancy and so on, and that indeed that's probably some of the most important parts that you will deal with in the whole process. Thank you for that. A couple of follow-up questions. First of all, from Claudia Beamish.
I'm reassured as well as some other members who've expressed concerns about the tenanted sector to hear that you will have some focus on that very complex problem. In relation, really following on from Margaret McDougall's question about new entrants to farming, I'm interested more broadly in whether you've been able to look at how you'll reach out to young people across Scotland, in urban Scotland and in, for instance, the ex-mining areas, which are quite deprived, where there are a lot of isolated young people who are cut off from services and may not exactly know how they might become more empowered, but would certainly, I suspect, having been a teacher and a youth worker, would want to grasp that opportunity if they knew it was there for them. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that at all, and indeed whether you have any particularly young advisors in your midst as well. Thank you.
I have had a conversation with people from Young Scot who are keen to get involved and to find a way of engaging people across Scotland on this one. How young is young when it comes to advisors? Wait and see.
I think one of the really encouraging things that has happened in some of the localities that have gone into community ownership are the opportunities that has opened up for younger people. When Gia went into community ownership, for instance, there was nobody living on the island in their 20s, 30s, possibly even early 40s. And there are now quite a few people in that age group, and the same is true of Noida. And that's happened largely because under the new ownership arrangements, it's been possible for these folk to get business premises and indeed living accommodation in a way that wasn't possible under the previous dispensation. So I think that's positive in that context, because I'm well aware that from whether it's rural development or any kind of development, the key demographic is that one. It's people in their 20s and 30s. And of course, we've seen a lot of population movement. The structure of population in rural Scotland today is entirely different to what it was, say, in the past. And by the past, I mean even as recently as 40 or 50 years ago. And that's happened for all sorts of reasons, and it's a very general phenomenon across the developed world of people moving. It's referred to, I think, by social scientists as counter-urbanization. People moving out of towns and cities to live either as commuters or as second home owners or retirement owners or whatever in the countryside. And that's fine, except that these people tend, particularly in the remoter parts of rural Scotland, these people tend to be older. Now, speaking as one who's well into his 60s himself, I don't mean that these people should be written off, but I do think that one of the absolutely fundamental issues in regard to development of these communities is to make it easier for younger people, whether they have their roots in these communities or not, is to make it easier for these people to have opportunities and particularly somewhere to live. Because a very, very basic problem in respect of all of this that no doubt we will be considering is and this committee has looked at that issue also, is the undoubted lack of so-called affordable housing, or indeed housing of any kind in many localities. And at the back of that also is an even more fundamental question of how this society of Scotland generally, including this government, including the Scottish Government and this Parliament, how do we think about rural Scotland? What is it for? Is it ultimately somewhere nice that people from urban Scotland can go for a day out or to have a holiday home or a retirement home? Or is it somewhere that can be dynamic and provide opportunities for people economically and otherwise in that locality itself? I, needless to say, tend towards the latter view rather than the former, but it's a very, very basic issue that I guess underlies a lot of what we are going to be considering over the next 18 months or so.
It's a paradox that there's a lot of people want to live in the countryside, but they don't want to do the dirty jobs of being farmers, whatever. Indeed, which can be very rewarding, but require physical work. Thank you for that. Another follow-up by Alec Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. In two parts, if I may, very briefly. I'll just start by saying that I sympathise with Jim Hunter about people in their 60s. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. We still have a lot to offer. But just on, I was slightly concerned by what you said on the subject of new entrants, not because of what you said, but simply because I'm sure you're aware there are a lot of other people working on this problem. And it prompted me to wonder, as there are in some of the other areas you're going to be looking at, and I just wonder what steps you can take to avoid duplication in these areas, because obviously there'll be a complete waste of time, and how you will work with others who are already working in these fields, how you go about that. Just briefly. And my second point was that the subject of gear has quite understandably come up a lot this morning, and Jim Hunter, in something he said, did refer to the fact that it required quite an input of public funding to get that off the ground, understandably. Can I ask whether any sort of constriction has been put into the amount of public funding that might be required as a result of the recommendations you make, whether that is something you've got to think about in terms of the recommendations you make, or whether, as far as your recommendations at this stage are concerned, the public purse is an open book?
I don't think the public purse is an open book. We are being asked to
Indeed.
have some kind of indicative economic analysis of the impact of our recommendations. So we will work to that. Sorry, the first question was, it was a good one.
It was really on sort of how do you avoid duplication with
Yes,
other
avoiding
people working
duplication.
in-
I think, I mean, we will just keep trying to have 360-degree vision on this one, but we would welcome comments from members of this committee as you see, you know, issues which are, or processes in the Parliament in particular, which are relevant to our work, then do alert us to the fact that they're happening and give us introductions to who's doing it, and we will work as closely as we can with them to avoid duplication, as you say. Yeah.
Could I just touch on the question of cost of this? And you're right, of course, to say that money was invested in GEAR to bring about the change of ownership. I think it's important not to exaggerate the cost of this. Up to now, something like 500,000 acres has gone into community ownership in the Highlands and Islands since the Ascent buyout of 1992. The cost to the public purse and the lottery together, because quite a lot of this money has been lottery money rather than taxpayers' money, the cost of all of that together, of bringing about the ownership change, is the same as the cost of 600 yards of the Edinburgh tramway. So, now, I don't suggest for a moment that money that's being spent on the tramway is being misspent, but it does indicate that the cost of bringing about community ownership is sometimes exaggerated. It's also the cost of the 500,000 acres is equivalent to the amount that goes to landowners and farmers in the UK by way of agricultural subsidy every 2 or 3 days. So one shouldn't exaggerate the amount of public money that has been invested in this process so far, and particularly one should relate that amount, which in the greater scheme of things, as I've said, is not very substantial. One should relate that amount to the tremendous benefits that have been secured in the way of the development of these communities and the opportunities that have been opened up for them.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for their evidence. It's been a useful scoping session, and it opens up all sorts of possibilities of our cooperation with you and getting updates as we go along. And I'd like to thank you very much for your contribution this morning. We'll now suspend briefly to change over. Committee to order, please, and return to the agenda. Agenda item 3 on the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group report. The final agenda item this morning is for the committee to hear from the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group on their recently published report, and I would welcome our witnesses for the meeting today, David Howitt and Joe Ellis, who are from Forestry Commission Scotland. Good morning. Welcome to the meeting. We have quite a lot of questions to ask you, so I think you'll be able to give us your answers, and if there's any need for longer summings up, we can perhaps leave these to the end. If we're thinking about the report, which we very much welcome, maybe you might want to give us some of the reasons for there not being a more positive attitude to woodland creation in recent years, for a start.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, perhaps just to explain our position here, that we both work for the Secretariat of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, and Dr. Andrew Barber, who was the chair of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, was very sorry that he couldn't make it today, but unfortunately had an unchangeable commitment this morning. Just to answer your question about different attitudes to woodland creation over the years, I suppose I've been at it in Scotland since the mid-80s, and it's been interesting to see how things have fluctuated, because certainly when I started, there was when you had new woodland creation proposals, there tended to be quite strong interest about the implications for agricultural land. And then there was a policy switch in the late 80s as we saw food surpluses and so on across Europe. And the rhetoric then was about sort of bringing trees down onto better land. And it was interesting at that stage that quite a lot of concern about woodland expansion moved to issues of conservation and landscaping, and obviously Cors Célèbre up in the Flow Country. And a lot of work has been done since then to try and address that in terms of the consultation processes we go through for new planting proposals, both for on the public forest estate and also grant-aided public planting proposals in terms of environmental impact assessment and so forth. But I guess what precipitated, in particular, the work of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group is agricultural things have gone through a cycle again, and there's more concern about food security and so forth, which means that once again we're in a situation where there's concern that expressed in Scottish farmer meetings of farmers and all the rest of it about the potential implications of woodland expansion on food production. And I guess that was, as I say, what precipitated the work of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, although clearly in doing this work it was a broadly based group, so they're looking at the wide range of land use interests. And I guess what we had was the land use strategy, which had picked up these concerns about woodland expansion. Proposal 7 of the land use strategy said that there should be more close identification of the types of land in Scotland which were suitable for woodland expansion and associated processes. And that, in effect, provided the brief for the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group to take forward that proposal from the land use strategy, accepting really that you can't get quartz into pint pots or whatever. And it is a question of trying to do one's best to achieve integration.
Do you wish to say anything? Just indicate if you want to. That's fine. Following that up a bit, did the group, work in an inclusive and it's an inclusive approach you're identifying, but it obviously has to do with diverse issues. Do you think that you achieved something that will be a practical set of proposals that can be taken forward as soon as possible in order that we do get to the extension of forestry planting as well as woodland planting?
Could I ask Joe perhaps just to explain how the group set about its work and the consultation process and so on, because that may help provide background to the answer.
Yeah, well, so we had a group of people was brought together from a very wide range of interests, and they were chosen to have a sort of practical interest in this. And I think you asked whether it's going to be practically useful. I think Dr. Andrew Barber would never have let anything be done that wasn't very strongly grounded in reality and very, very practically based. So we had 7 meetings of the group, and while there was a huge amount of expertise brought to the group from all the different members, from all different interests, they did recognise that they needed some further input from an even broader group of interests. So they held a consultation exercise. They called it a call for views, in fact. They didn't put something out and ask for a response to it. They asked for people to express their views and highlight suggestions for how they could move forwards. And that was really well subscribed, actually. About 140 people sent responses to that, people and organisations, I should say. And the group then went out and held a series of public meetings around the country. And again, they were really well attended. And I think one of the positive things about those was that you had people from all interests associated with forestry, from farmers, environmentalists, foresters of all kinds, coming together. And it really did illustrate how the issues are different in different parts of the country. The meetings had very different focuses around, as we went from Oban to Inverness to Newton St Boswells.
Thank you for that. We'll explore some of these in more detail, starting off with the targets issue, which was briefly mentioned there. Alec Ferguson.
Thank you very much. And good morning to you. The government's original hoped-for target was, when they started focusing on the subject of forestry, was for a 25% cover of Scotland by 2050. And you've suggested in the report that this much should be changed to 100,000 hectares of new woodland to be planted by 22. Can I ask you what effect that has on the percentage of the woodland? How much does that differ from the 25% target that the government's talking about?
The real difference is, in the short term, it's much the same. In other words, if you translate that 25% aspiration by the second half of the century into an annual target and do your arithmetic, you get back to 10,000 hectares a year. So the 100,000 hectares over 10 years is consistent with that. The important difference is, rather than saying in the long term we have this target of 25%, people were sort of translating the aspiration into a target of 25% woodland cover, and that was frankly what was frightening quite a lot of people. Rather than saying that, what the group is advising is that it's more sensible just to look ahead 10 years, say, yep, 10,000 hectares a year on average over the next 10 years, for increased woodland cover in Scotland. And then the other thing the group recommended is there should be a further review in about 7 or 8 years' time, looking at the next 10 years. So we shouldn't be trying to plan too far ahead.
Thank you. And does your target and your proposal, do they take account of current harvesting figures, and in particular woodland reduction that's taking place at the moment for things like wind farms, which is quite considerable? Because my understanding is that compensatory planting is not keeping up with the deforestation that's taking place. And I just wondered if you've been able to take that into account, and if not, what the net increase is that you're looking at.
Well, in terms of the problem about woodland loss, is it's quite difficult to get absolutely accurate figures on woodland loss because they're partly associated with planning consents for wind farms and so forth. But we've done our best to bring together the available information, and we think that over the last 10 years we've lost about 20,000 hectares, which is average of 2,000 hectares per year over the last 10 years. But what that reflects is, if you like, an era when for some of the earlier wind farms there was fairly large areas of forests were cut down, and since then the government's control of woodland removal policies have been brought in. And we're seeing them biting. You're right in saying there's no actual compensatory planting we can point our fingers at yet. But it's already biting in the sense that, to begin with, the engineers building wind farms were thinking the easiest thing was to deck the whole thing to reduce wind turbulence for the turbines. But now, because they know there's this control of woodland removal policy, they're taking a lot more care to minimise the amount of woodland loss as a result of wind farm development.
So in coming forward with your proposals, you are assuming not a great deal of woodland loss in the figures you've come forward to. Right. Sorry, yeah, I do apologise.
I was just going to say, could I add just to what you said there about the woodland loss figures? You said about 20,000 has been lost over the last 10 years, and that's the figures. Not all of that is from wind farms, though. A lot of it, about I think it's 30-40% is habitat restoration, so restoring open ground habitats from woodland. So it's not all because of wind farms kicking that off.
No, I appreciate that, but thank you for that clarification. Again, going back to your targets, there is an obvious requirement that a certain percentage, and indeed the timber industry would require that a certain percentage of what is to be planted be commercial in nature. Can I ask what you've recommended in terms of what species should be planted to take into account the need for a percentage of commercial planting within it, and what percentage you believe that should be?
Well, the general approach, for example, in the Scottish Forestry Strategy and subsequent documents, was to suggest that in broad terms it should be 60% productive or commercial planting, 40% in loose language native woodland planting. Now, really, what the group was doing was two things. First of all, it was endorsing that in general terms, and the reality at the moment on the ground is that's not what's happening. It tends, if anything, it's the other way around, if not more, something like 70% native, 30% productive or commercial. The other point the group made was it's not always helpful to have that clear, hard and fast distinction on the one hand between commercial forest, on the other hand between native woodland. And it was recognizing that, for example, when people are planting native woodlands, they should do it with an eye to producing timber at some stage. And I mean, you get that classic examples of that where you've got native pine, Scots pine, native woodlands, where landowners have chosen to space it 2,000 stems per hectare, so they can produce pine timber from that. So it's a native woodland which will produce timber. And equally, in terms of the so-called commercial planting, to recognize that actually you need well-designed productive woodlands so that it isn't repeating, if you like, some of the mistakes of the past, but it's there to produce timber, but it's also something which fits into the landscape, has biodiversity benefits, and so forth. So the group was very clear that there should be more work done to try to get more productive woodland on the ground, and this should be both in terms of working with the industry and also as we move forward to design of grant regimes under the next Scotland Rural Development Programme to try to make sure that, if you like, we do our arithmetic so that there's not a bias one way or the other.
Yeah, I'm sure I think we'll come into the SRDP later on, but just to wrap, thank you for that, because I think I mean, I know the private sector have got real concerns about the amount of commercial planting that's taking place. I'm delighted to hear that you're looking at reversing or you would hope to reverse the current trend, which I think is about 20-80, 20 commercial native at the moment. And because I think, certainly coming from the southwest of Scotland, obviously it's very important. The sustainability of the timber industry is very important. But just to wrap this little section up, can I finally ask, assuming the targets that you are suggesting are adopted and agreed, and you mentioned the land use strategy, do you think it will require any alteration of the land use strategy to bring that about?
No, Jo, do you want to answer?
I think the land use strategy is expressing fairly high-level objectives, and I think what we're saying is completely consistent with that. Land use strategy doesn't go to the stage of allocating different land for different uses. So, no, I think it's completely consistent with that.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question in the background to this? Because obviously 2/3 of our forests are owned by the private sector. When there was a great burst of forest growing and planting, much of it in the north seems to me to be, or a quantity is, on land which is very difficult to harvest from. And I just wondered if there's any sense of the actual forest footprint as to whether, in fact, some of that would ever be replanted at all.
I think there are certainly issues in certain areas where we accept that there's good reasons not to restock. And I mean, the classic example of that would be areas of the flow country, for example, where the trees are being cut down and there's not restocking. And we have a policy regime in place, potentially using environmental impact assessment, where the landowner wants to deforest. But I will admit we're fairly tight on that, because both in terms of what Scottish objectives, but also in terms of international commitments to sustainable forest management, you don't want to have a free-for-all in terms of deforestation. There's also another point that I should have raised in relation to Mr. Ferguson's question about the production of timber in Scotland, because we just had a new production forecast of softwood availability published for Scotland, showing that the potential timber for harvesting in Scotland continues to be on the increase, which is good news. over the next 25 years. But what we do need to do is, this is a potential of softwood availability based on what's growing on the ground. But we will also need to look at what's the question you raised, Convener, about access. And so what we've just done is put together a committee chaired by our non-executive commissioner, Hamish MacLeod from BSW, and with members from the industry, just looking at this softwood availability and looking at issues of accessibility to take a view as to what is likely to be the real timber availability for industry. But as I say, the forecast does look pretty good, in fact.
We'll look forward to hearing that. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Just another point on the targets. The Woodland Trust, and I believe also the Forestry Commission, are engaging with the MOD and local authorities to try and identify unused parcels of land which would be leased for the purposes of tree planting. And RM Condor in my own constituency recently entered into an arrangement with the Woodland Trust to plant 50,000 native trees across 95 acres as part of the Diamond Woods project, which I think all told will take in 20 locations across Scotland. I wonder if you can indicate how successful these efforts are proving and the extent to which they might contribute to hitting these targets, or would their contribution be over and above the targets?
No, the short answer is these all contribute to the targets, and in a very important way as well. I mean, we've got, you're referring to initiatives, for example, by the Woodland Trust Scotland. We've got other initiatives, for example, Borders Forest Trust. And when we use the phrase, in loose terms, we talk about publicly owned forest, private forest, but actually the private forest covers a wide range of different types of activity and increasingly includes the activities by communities and voluntary bodies.
And what's your awareness of the responsiveness of the MOD and local authorities in general to these approaches?
Well, I think in terms of the MOD, I haven't had any contact with them in Scotland. As I understand it, and I may be wrong about this, that more of the Woodland Trust work with the MOD is south of the border, but I'm not entirely sure about that. In terms of local authorities, there tends to be quite a lot of good working with local authorities. And I would say that's particularly, I'm not saying it doesn't happen in other parts of Scotland, but particularly relevant, for example, in the area of the Central Scotland Green Network. We've got 19 local authorities. We're trying to create these green networks across Central Scotland, and so it's very important that we work closely with local authorities in general policy terms, what's in local development plans, for example, and also in terms of individual projects. And just to give you one specific example there, that the Forestry Commission has recently, I believe, leased some land from a local authority in what's called the Cunningar Loop in the heart of Glasgow, so that we can take forward a woodland restoration project on what was formerly local authority land.
Thank you.
Very good. Just to finish off this section about targets, what involvement the Scottish Government had in finalising this report?
Yes, Convener, sorry, I should have mentioned that perhaps at the beginning, that I hope there will be a response very shortly from the Scottish Government responding to the group's report.
Thank you. Well, turning to stakeholder buy-in and sectoral impacts, Annabel Ewing's going to kick off.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Obviously, a lot of work has gone in. The committee had been aware that there were many, perhaps what could be termed competing views about land use and forestation and so on. Obviously, you have managed to arrive at this report, and all credit to you for doing that. I just wondered, in light of all the various competing, diverse interests, and as expressed by those involved in this review group, I would hope, but it'd be useful to have it confirmed today, that this report actually does reflect the balanced conclusion of all parties concerned, such that this would provide a way forward, at least in principle, bringing everybody together so that we can hopefully address the competing interests in a measured and balanced way, as opposed to go back to, having constant discussions about it. I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
Yes, I mean, as you'll see from the membership of the group, it was a broad-ranging membership with, for example, the President of the National Farmers Union for Scotland, National Sheep Association, and so forth, and as well as the forestry industry. And all those who were on the group were happy to sign up to the work of to the group's report. And I mean, just what isn't in the, if you like, in the printed word, so to speak, is certainly, I think Joe would probably agree with me, as we went through the work of the group, it was interesting how there was perhaps, some of the tensions you're referring to were reflected round the table in the early meetings of the group. And as the group did its work, I think we managed to sort of bring people together. I don't know whether, Joe, you want to add to that.
I'd absolutely agree with that. I think it was a great opportunity for people to have very full and frank discussions and air their points of view. And I think it is really, really positive that we've come to a report that everyone could sign up to in the end of that.
Perhaps I should add, I don't think we can pretend that we'll always have total sweetness in life, sweetness and light in relation to every single planting application in the future as a result of this. But hopefully we can put in place processes which will minimise some of the tensions that gave rise to this work.
Well, it's interesting that you went on to mention that, because that was really what I was coming to next, which is where you anticipate such tensions. I mean, for example, we have heard from some about the recommendation on, well, in terms of your analysis of types of land for tree planting, and where it's mentioned that in worst case scenario, this could cause a 2% reduction in livestock numbers in terms of utilising that kind of land. And so it's just really to see where you see the tensions and already what can be done to address those tensions. Because obviously, there are concerns about, if there's a reduction in livestock land, that would be of a concern to livestock farmers. So where do you see this going? Because obviously this is really just a very important start of the process.
Absolutely right. I think, as I said at the beginning, there's been this cycle really that 20, 30 years ago people were taking agricultural implications of woodland expansion very seriously, and then with food surpluses and all the rest of it moved on to worrying about conservation, landscaping. And I think part of the outcome of this work, I hope anyway, will be that once again, there's very serious consideration given to the agricultural implications of woodland expansion proposals, wherever possible, looking for win-wins in terms of shelter, in terms of just the detailed decisions on the ground, and where there is some loss of agricultural production, that's minimised. And that will be, if you like, the detailed consideration of individual proposals. And then at the more strategic level, for example, if you think of forest and woodland strategies in local authorities, one of the recommendations here, recommendation 4, is about sub-regional analysis. And really what the group was trying to get at there was refining the current approach, which in crude terms identified certain parts of different local authority areas as preferred for forestry expansion, which may be fine today, but if you've got quite a lot of woodland expansion, say, takes place in those areas over the next 3 or 4 years, then suddenly what was sort of perhaps 20% woodland cover today rises to 25%. People see it possibly rising to 30%. And so it's this concept, if you like, of setting a threshold, saying, yeah, it's a good area for woodland expansion now, but only up to a certain point. So in other words, it's recognizing that there's a dynamic here. And if you just because you're saying it's preferred for woodland expansion doesn't mean to say it should go from, should we say, 20% woodland cover to 80% woodland cover or something like that.
That's very helpful, because obviously, the timber industry is a very important industry for Scotland as well, but we have to, allow all the industries a shot and to breathe and develop. Lastly, Convener, if I may, in the report, you state that one of the conclusions is that around 46% of Scotland's land is largely unavailable for woodland creation in terms of current issues. Do you see the issues that would preclude that land being available changing at any point, or being at least seeing the possibility that there could be changes with respect to whatever are the current obstacles to using that huge tract of land in Scotland, which is currently unavailable for...
In some cases, it's straightforward unsuitability because it's the top of a mountain or somewhere like that. But also, I think within that 60%, there's about 20% area, which is the so-called designated areas. So, Joe, do you want to speak a little bit about the designated areas?
Yeah, so I mean, you referred to some work that we did to underpin the group's considerations. They really wanted to make sure they were focusing on the areas that are most likely to have woodland expansion. So as you say, they took out all the bits that are least likely to have woodland expansion, that 46%. And in amongst that, there were things that could change, like, for example, the presumption against planting on large areas of woodland on prime agricultural land. But really, most of that area is not going to be the focus of woodland expansion. But the next area that they looked at, which is a further 20% of Scotland, is under designations of various sorts. And for the purposes of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, again, we didn't really focus too much on that area. We were saying, well, it's largely not in consideration. But actually, SNH explained that there are some areas of that land where there are significant opportunities, particularly for native woodland creation and well-designed productive woodlands in that designated area. So even though the analysis we did excluded some 2/3 of Scotland from our consideration, we did accept that there were still opportunities within that. It's just that that is not the main focus of woodland creation.
Very one last brief question. Where does MOD land fall within this discussion? Is it part of the 46% of Scottish land that is absolutely not a goer for woodland planting? Is it the 20% that's designated?
That was just done on land capability and constraints such as peat, that kind of thing. It wasn't done on ownership. And we weren't saying that the bit that has most potential can therefore have woodland all over it or anything like that. It was just a bit to focus on.
Thank you. We're looking at integrated land use strategy and the cross-cutting issues. Graham Day, start.
You mentioned peat there. How do we ensure that forestry dovetails or integrates with other land use demands, such as peatland restoration, which is the potential to make such a huge contribution to tackling the emissions issue? How do we achieve the appropriate balance?
Well, I think the first thing to start with is to get the best scientific evidence you have, because essentially, in terms of the peat forestry carbon argument, clearly, as trees grow, they sequester carbon, but also peat is a very, very important carbon store. And so what we've done is we've got the best available advice from the scientists as to where that balance lies between planting peat and not planting peat and leaving it as peat. And in crude terms, for new planting, what we come up with is what we call a half-metre rule. So in other words, if the peat depth is less than half a metre, that potentially is available for tree planting. If the peat depth is greater than half a metre, then it's probably better left as peat, and that's for new planting. It becomes slightly more complicated when you're dealing with existing forests that have already been planted on deep peats, because then you're into issues about, the extent to which it's possible to restore the peat habitat, or if you like, the damage has already been done, and that's something we're currently working on, is how to refine the guidance in relation to restocking.
I note from a recent written answer I had from the Environment Minister that we're talking in terms of electricity production already in the forest estate at around 402 megawatts of wind and hydro capacity, with about another 429 megawatts under construction. Also, 156 megawatts obtained planning consent, but construction not yet commenced, while 215 megawatts capacity is in planning, with making up about twice as much as is likely to be scoped in future. That must, referring to the previous question, be a different approach that's being taken now. I take it that this is where we're thinking about rivers as well as keyhole areas of forestry made available for this. And would you think that the part of the cross-cutting element of this is that actually there's a lot of community benefit potentially coming out of this, which is not mentioned by people who talk about wind farms being sited in forestry land?
That's right, Convener. At a very early stage in the work of the group, they asked the question about potential loss of woodlands in relation to wind farms, and we produced, as all the papers were put on the website, there's a paper on this. And for the reasons we discussed earlier, there may be a certain amount of woodland that's lost, but essentially that will be dealt with by compensatory planting. And then moving away from specifically to the work of the group to the Forestry Commission's approach to renewable energy development, you're quite right, there's a target of 2 gigawatts by 2020 on the National Forest estate, and that covers both wind development and hydro development. And where we put a lot of effort is in terms of developing ways to provide for community benefits from these developments on the National Forest Estate, which can really take place in three possible ways. Where we've got developers who are doing wind farms or hydro schemes, then we're saying at the very least what they must do is offer a community benefit of £5,000 per megawatt, which, say, for a 20 megawatt scheme translates to £100,000 a year, which is not inconsiderable. There are also an option being built in to require the developer to provide basically equity, a shareholding to communities if they want it for those developments. And at the same time, in the areas which aren't being taken forward by developers, we're using the National Forest Land Scheme to open the National Forest Estate up to communities who are interested. It tends more often to be hydro, but if they're wanting to take forward either hydro or wind schemes on the National Forest Estate, the communities can come to us and then take forward community schemes. And at the moment, in fact, I was at a meeting a couple of days ago with SCVO and Community Energy Scotland, where we were thrashing through some of the issues we're dealing with about how we set a fair rent for communities, because clearly on the one hand we want to encourage the community endeavour, but on the other hand, in terms of Scottish public finance rules and all the rest of it, we need to make sure that we get fair value for the taxpayer. So we're currently working through those issues with community bodies to make sure we can have a streamlined approach for communities wanting to develop things on the National Forest Estate.
We certainly probably would like to hear more about that as it develops in due course. Next question from Margaret McDougall. Graham. Oh, pardon me. Where are we at? Number 10. Oh, it's Angus MacDonald. Pardon me.
Thank
Can't
you.
read my own writing.
Thank you, Convener. Worth waiting for, I hope. The report proposes better involvement of local stakeholders through the regional forestry forums. As we know, we already have a multitude of regional bodies such as area advisory groups with regard to water management and regional project assessment committees through for the SRDP. How do you see these regional bodies best working together, and would it not be better if they were perhaps combined with your proposed regional forestry forums to try and declutter the area?
I mean, I think we will always be open to suggestions for streamlining. I think at the moment what happens is the regional forestry forums have a very different job from the RPACs, in the sense that the RPACs have a narrow remit in terms of the Scotland Rural Development Programme to be taking decisions on which projects to give money to under rural priorities. Whereas the regional forestry forums have evolved out of what we used to run, which are called regional advisory committees. And the regional forestry forums, they meet typically, say, 3 or 4 times a year in how we divide Scotland up into the 5 regions, and will include people from a wide range of backgrounds, communities, local authorities, environmental organisations, and what the group here is suggesting, making sure that we have strong agricultural representation as well. And certainly the Commission has always found the advice it gets from regional forestry forums or regional advisory committees incredibly useful as a local sounding board, if you like, as to whether there's issues I was with the Highland one up in the far north in August, and we're talking about these very issues of woodland expansion, effect on agricultural land in Caithness. They may be discussing water issues in southwest Scotland, and certainly we find it incredibly useful to get the advice from these experts who are on regional forestry forums. But as you say, if there are a better, more joined-up way to do it, then something we'd be open to.
Okay, but in the meantime, you'd certainly advocate the retention of standalone regional forestry forums. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Margaret.
Thank you. Good morning. The report recognises that there are a number of cross-cutting areas where improvements might be realised through increasing woodland cover, for example, biodiversity, climate change and water quality. To what extent does the panel expect woodland planting to 2022 to contribute to other environmental targets?
I think we're doing some quite interesting work for example, on the water environment that you mentioned, where we're targeting the woodland creation where there's real opportunities to make a difference, looking at at where it can help with diffuse pollution and making sure that we target the woodland creation to the specific areas where it can make a difference. So I think even the woodland expansion between now and 2022, 100,000 hectares can make a huge difference if it's done in the right places and the right way, the right kinds of woodlands. So yeah, I think it can make a big difference.
So through the convener, has that been modelled and quantified?
On the water stuff, water environment, we're looking, for example, at the Tay catchment and mapping the precise areas where woodland creation can make the most difference. That is a pilot and it's moving further. But yes, we also have, for example, maps of forest habitat networks which show where we would be best creating native woodlands to expand and connect existing native woodlands to make the biggest difference. I think that's the issue here. If you do the right woodland in the right place, it can make a really big difference, even a small area of it. And that's what we're trying to do, making sure it goes in the right places to make a big difference.
On that point, Claudia Beamish.
Very much, Convener, and good morning to you both. Could I particularly ask you, Joe, and also, of course, you, David, as well, but in your capacity as the Land Use and Climate Change Policy Officer for the Forestry Commission Scotland, if I got that right, could you comment at all on, I think it's recommendation 16 and the carbon calculator and how that could be used, because there's often quite a lot of challenges, for instance, in a different context with farming or with schools being able to actually seriously quantify the carbon as lay people. And I wonder if you could comment on that at all.
Yeah, there was something that came up through sort of quite a lot of stakeholder comment and through the group that the carbon argument is one that's starting to turn farmers on to woodland creation. They're starting to see it as something that can help with their own holdings carbon footprint. Initiatives like the Farming for a Better Climate initiative are bringing that kind of thing to the fore, helping farmers to realise how they can reduce their carbon impact. And I think the group felt that you do need to know what difference what difference woodland planting will actually make to your carbon footprint, and a carbon calculator is a way to do that. There are some carbon calculators in existence being trialled in England and being developed for English situations. We also have the Woodland Carbon Code, which is used through which we can calculate the carbon benefits of woodland creation. And I think the challenge now is to make sure we can bring those together into a simple to use carbon calculator that anyone can use to see what difference the woodland will make to their holdings carbon balance.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, that's helpful. Could I also ask you more broadly about resilience in relation both to climate change and also in relation to possible pests to the forestry, to trees more generally? I know there was something last week about a new disease of which there are very serious concerns in relation to pine forests, and I wondered if you could comment on both those.
Well, I mean, in the context of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, they recognise that we do need to design new planting to be resilient to changes in the future, and pests and diseases are obviously a huge part of that. We are, in the Forestry Commission more generally, looking at ways of communicating the need to diversify the kinds of trees that are planted, to look at what the conditions will be in the future and make sure that people plan their forestry not only to be suitable for the conditions now, but the conditions in the future, choosing species that will last. And we also have larger programs looking at early rapid response to pests and diseases. I mean, David, you may want to say more about pests and diseases and the response that we're putting in place.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yes, I mean, obviously we've got serious concerns at the moment about pests and diseases. We have a number. We've got what's called Dothrosstroma or red band needle blight, which is attacking pine trees, lodgepole pine, Corsican pine, and also you indicated worried about the possible impact on native pine, and one or two outbreaks confirmed on native pine. We've also got what's called Phytophthora ramoram, which is attacking larch trees as well as rhododendron and blaeberry and so forth, largely in the southwest and in Argyllshire. And we've just had some first confirmed outbreak in Scotland of what's called ash dieback on some new planting in the Kirkpatrick Hills. So we've got some serious concerns, partly associated with climate change, but the other thing that people seem fairly clear it's associated with is the development of the single European market, increased trade in plant material. For example, this is new news to me, but you've got seed of ash that is collected in Britain, taken to the continent to be in nurseries and then brought back as seedlings to Britain. And so that's another pathway of introduction for pests and diseases. So it's something that I would say is extremely high priority for us at the moment, to be working with researchers and making sure we've got a joined up approach within Scottish Government to do all we can to tackle these problems.
I was hoping that Claudia was going to spell out what that pine needle disease was called, but I'm sure that the official
couldn't come up with a Latin name. Sorry.
Thank you for that. We want to turn to funding issues, and again, Margaret McDougall to kick off here.
We all know that the CAP is currently being reviewed, and your group recommends that forestry should be included in the greening measures of the new CAP, and also that annual payment should be retained when farmers convert to forestry. How can annual payments to some converted agricultural land be justified if they will not be continued for existing forestry that requires ongoing management?
Right, if I can answer, at the moment, the payments for woodland grants are really in two categories. So on the one hand, you have the payment that's made for the planting of the trees and the initial maintenance. So that would be like weeding operations to make sure the trees grow. So you have that as what we would call the sort of the woodland creation grants. And then slightly separate from that, at the moment, annual payments are made to farmers under what's called the farmland premium. And that is to compensate the farmer for the loss of agricultural income. So in other words, if you're taking a piece of land, you're planting woodland, on the one hand, you've got the cost involved in planting and looking after that woodland. And on the other hand, you've got the fact you aren't getting any agricultural production from that land. So the idea of the annual payments is an element of compensation for loss of agricultural value from the land. So that was the rationale of the group wanting to see those annual payments maintained into the future. They've been around since, these annual payments have been around for 20 years or more. And the current draft of the Rural Development Regulation in Europe suggests that these annual payments should be dropped. And what the group's recommending is that whatever can be done to persuade Europe to keep the provision for those annual payments into the future.
Let's continue with my next
Please
question.
do, yes.
Then. How can forestry be integrated into the CAP greening measures then?
Well, what you have in CAP is you have obviously the Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2, and this, we're really talking about Pillar 1 of CAP here. And at the moment we have the rules, for example, for good agricultural and environmental condition, and the other measures for what they call cross-compliance. And I think what the group had in mind here is there's a lot of discussion happening, as you know, about the greening of Pillar 1. But if, for example, there could be sensible ways in which you recognise the value even of, for example, hedgerow trees as part of a good agricultural environmental condition requirement, then that would make sense. As the group was very keen to sort of see forestry not just in narrow terms, but the full spectrum, if you like, from one end, you could say hedgerow trees, right through to large-scale forests. So it was just looking for opportunities that might be there for relatively small-scale tree opportunities in the context of greening a Pillar 1, I think was what the group was after there.
Yep, Graham Day.
Just to develop that a little bit, if, so say for example, a farmer decided to give over 7% of a field to creating a small woodland, perhaps to provide shelter for livestock, would you like to see that counted into the greening?
Well, I think in terms of achieving forestry policy objectives, it would make sense. But clearly, I recognise that the greening of CAP, there's an awful lot of wider politics about the greening of CAPs. But just to answer your narrow question, a narrow forestry sense, that would be quite good news.
Alec Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. I might just point out that there are some of us who don't think that greening should be in Pillar 1, it ought to be in Pillar 2, but I would also accept that's a wider not for this occasion. But on the subject of CAP reform, which is obviously crucial, particularly in terms of the new SRDP that comes into place, this committee has spent a great deal of time obviously considering CAP reform, and we'll be considering it more. One of the real concerns that I think is now most people accept is that agreement by 2014 is unlikely to happen. And therefore, we're looking at what's going to happen between 2014 and 15. Given the fact that there is already nothing left in the SRDP budget for woodland planting, therefore we are already in a sort of hiatus of new plantings with SRDP support. How important do you think it is, that, and what representations have you been able to make as the advisory group to the importance of a bridging arrangement being in place if there is no agreement in 2014?
The group, as you say, was very keen that there should be whatever can be done, could be done, to provide a transition between the current SRDP and the next SRDP. One important measure which the group recommended was the continuation of the planning grant, because if we do, due to European things and all the rest of it out of control, if we do find ourselves with a gap, what we want to avoid is the position we were in at the beginning of this SRDP, where you kind of go right back to base level and the whole thing grinds to a halt. And then you've got to crank the machinery up again to get woodland creation going. And so what would be good to aim for is to use mechanisms like this planning grant to encourage people to carry on preparing proposals, even though they won't be 100% sure what will be in the next SRDP. At least I think they can be reasonably confident there will be forestry measures in the next SRDP. So encourage them to carry on preparing schemes so that then when we reach January 2015 or wherever it is and we can open up the next SRDP, we're not back to square one, but we've got a pile of reasonably well worked up applications that can go into the system fairly quickly.
If I could continue that theme, Convener, thank you. I mean, do you have evidence that that is the case, that people are looking at it? And further to that, do you think that a sort of continuation of the current SRDP into the new one from the forestry point of view is satisfactory, or do you think there needs to be a different look at how woodland planting is encouraged through SRDP in order to try to achieve the targets that you've set?
We had a big hiatus between the closing of the Scottish Forestry Grant Scheme and the SRDP, which was a big change. Now, clearly there are things which can be improved in SRDP, both in terms of the administrative process and in terms of what we were speaking about earlier, in terms of the grant rate. So the ways in which we can take the opportunity of the next SRDP to improve things. But my own personal view is, rather than sort of tear up SRDP and try to start again, it's much better to build on what we've got. And hopefully by building on what we've got, we can also maintain some continuity so we don't have the same hiatus as we had last time.
And just finally, if I may, Convener, can I just ask whether I absolutely agree with what you say, but the time to be negotiating for all of that is now, rather than waiting until we're presented with something, I think. Is that sort of discussion taking place at this point in time? Yeah, without asking you to give away any secrets, but please feel free to do so if you want to. It is taking place. Well, that's a comfort. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dick Lyle.
Yes, if I could actually turn to the report itself, it's quite ranging and has 24 recommendations. I'll only pick out some of them that Convener will be quite happy to understand. And I found the interest in the context to start with. There's a deep cultural divide between forestry and farming. Do you think we can ever resolve that?
Ever is a big word. I think we can take steps to try and break it down. And one of the recommendations in the report was to do more, if you like, at the area of higher and further education, because one of the reflections of that historical divide between forestry and agriculture is you have the likes of the SAC, you have where I was at university in down the road doing the forestry at Edinburgh. And we didn't see, the agricultural students were 200 yards up the road and we hardly ever saw them apart from for social reasons. And I think there's work that can be done to particularly to take the advantage of the opportunity that's now happening with the merger of Scottish Agricultural College with the other land-based colleges, to see what we can do to encourage the development of more integrated courses for example, for those who are essentially agricultural students, but so that they can learn more about forestry and the opportunities for woodlands on farms. And that was one of the clear recommendations of the group, that we should be using that sort of opportunity to try to help break down these barriers.
If I can turn to the I know time is going on, but if I can turn to the comments I'd like to make. Again, it said those who plant woodlands feel that the system is not helping them to achieve this. In recommendation 3, you go on about the types of land for tree planting. We all go drive around this country and we see fields lying empty, or we see disused land, or basically land which is previously unused because the building's been knocked down. Do you think we should try and develop more planting around about, areas of towns and along strips, or even along motorways, in order to up our woodland planting?
Yes, I mean, I referred earlier to the work of the Central Scotland Green Network, and it's an important priority there to sort of see what can be done, for example, on vacant and derelict land, but also other areas in and around towns. And one of the initiatives the Forestry Commission has been running for 4 or 5 years now is what's called the Woodlands in and Around Towns initiative. And the idea of that is to do exactly what you're describing, is to look for opportunities to create often fairly small areas of woodland in and around towns, but critically they're near where people live. So rather than having these nice woodlands which are 200 miles away, you've got nice woodlands within 10 minutes walking distance. And interestingly, there's a piece of work which has just been commissioned by the National Health Service Institute for Health Research, which is actually doing an objective, evidence-based monitoring of the psychological benefits of having these woods in and around towns.
If the convener can bear with me, recommendation 7, you're going about grant rates. Can you tell me, do we still get do planters or businessmen or estates still get tax breaks in regards to planting of new woods?
In general terms, that was done away with in 1988. There are still certain wrinkles with the tax system, for example, in relation to there's inheritance tax release for commercial woodlands and things like that. So I wouldn't say there's no tax interaction, but what hit the headlines with the flow country and all that came to an end in 1988. Finally,
through you, convener, if I can ask, recommendation 16 and 17, which I find very interesting, the carbon calculator. Forestry Commission Scotland should produce a simple-to-use carbon-ready reckoner which allows land managers to identify whether or by how much woodland creation would help to reduce their land management carbon footprint. Is this work underway, or has it been? Sorry?
Perhaps had that question just a little earlier there.
It was just, as I say, I know I'm covering some of the other points, but it was just to
essentially we'll be building on work which is already underway to do that.
Thank you. Not at all. Thank you. Perhaps a final tidying up point from
thank you, convener. And it's to return to the SRDP and the objective stated in the report to encourage a greater integration between woodland planting and farming interests. And I note that you state that under the discussion on recommendation 10 at page 11 that single farm payment eligibility criteria for grazed woodland should also be changed to help achieve this greater integration, and that Forestry Commission Scotland should ensure that suitable technical guidance and support is available to that end. And I wonder what concretely you had in mind with respect to such support. And I mean, is it the case that that support is currently available? So if not, it's something new, what would it be? If it is currently available, what would be different about it going forward?
Essentially, the problem here is one actually that Andrew Barber, the chair of the group, had a particular case on his own farm, in fact, as just a case in point there, that he had had some woodland that he wanted to use for grazing for his cattle, which had made good sort of sheltered grazing. But essentially, I suppose in crude terms, you could say the rules say it's either in agricultural use or it's in forestry use. And if you start using woodland, if you start using woodland for agricultural purposes, then that makes sense in terms of the sheltered grazing and so forth. But what he was worried about was that he'd lose the agricultural grants that were available on the land. And so it's quite a complicated interaction, if you like, there between the agricultural grants and the forestry grants that the group was keen that we try to sort out.
And can I just ask then, so you feel that going forwards, this is something that's now been pinpointed sort of officially as an issue, and you're hopeful, therefore, that particularly looking at the operation of the SRTP going forward, that this will be a key element in terms of trying to find a solution to this?
Yeah, what the group was basically wanting to do, and it comes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about the sort of breaking down the sort of the barriers between agriculture and forestry, was making the rules more friendly for those who want to take sensible integrated approaches. And I say, if you've got a little bit of open woodland, which makes sense to use it for grazing as well, to not have a grant regime which gets in the way of that.
I think that suitably takes us around quite a lot of the issues which have been raised, and we're very pleased to be able to look at the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group's report, and we'll try to get some updates on that in due course. And thank the witnesses very much for the evidence you've given us this morning, because it's probably educated quite a lot of us a good deal more. Thank you. We'll finish this item and indeed close the session and state that the next meeting of the committee is on the 3rd of October, where we will take evidence from stakeholders on the budget in a roundtable format, as well as receiving a private informal briefing from Marine Scotland. Thank you very much. Close the meeting.